to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be working through Genesis 20 and 21, continuing the story of Abraham as he is now, we're getting back to the Isaac story as opposed to where we have seen Ishmael in conversation before this. Mike, I wanted to mention to you as we get into this, of course, you know that I've been working since Mike Heiser's passing with his material that he had started on a systematic theology book. We had talked about this years before he even grew ill. Excuse me. And he had said, because, my job as a teacher was generally systematic theology. That was my master's work. And then my professional teaching life was a lot of systematic theology courses and stuff. He came to me and said, and this is a couple of years before he knew he was even ill. He said, hey, would you ever want to, or I recommend you take your theology notes and turn them into a book, because we need that for just for material for a divine counsel discussion. And when I went back and I looked, and I told him this, I said, boy, they're just not ready, because having taught it, 100 some pages, 200 some pages of material, to switch it as it were over to a divine counsel worldview. I just noticed a lot of places that I was, besides what I had in print, that I would give to the students, when it came to discussing it with the students, it took a different flavor, right? And so I told him, it's just that they're just not ready. And then, things got busy and different things. And by the time when Mike passed away, the story continued this way. Drina came to me and said, Mike has about 6-7 chapters of a book on theology that he was starting, and the conversation just moved along to be, would you be interested in taking his work and, of course, doing with it what your plan had always been with Mike, and that is to do this book. And so I certainly jumped at that chance, and so that's what I'm doing now. And I bring it up here as a conversation piece because couple things. One, I just want to get your opinion in this kind of a forum where we're honestly just exchanging thoughts on the fly. How does a divine counsel worldview turn into a, quote, theology book? Is that a thing that can even be done? Does the divine counsel worldview as a concept give enough to warrant, I'd even say, a theology book? Here's the problem. You've got a lot of theologies or parts of a theology book that may likely not even be influenced by what I would call a plural Elohim worldview. And let's say the doctrine of the church. Now, I know Mike was all about, giving his views on baptism and the Lord's Supper, and that's definitely the way Mike thought. The challenge is, does the divine counsel worldview espouse a distinctive enough view to warrant it being part of a theology book? Or could you could you stay with your view of consubstantiation, for example, within the question of the Lord's Supper and still have a divine counsel worldview? Or could you have a symbolic view? Could you have a transubstantiation model? In other words, I think an open question that I'm still working through as I write this book with, by the way, I have Mike's material, but he's not around to talk to. So when I'm trying to think through, where he was on something versus where I'm going with something, it's a conversation with someone I can't have because all I have is his material, which is a unique idea anyway. But then I get into this question, well, does it matter, or do I have the right to say this is what a divine counsel worldview is theologically when it comes to some things that may, in my opinion, not have to be part of the worldview? So I throw that out as an open question to you because I'm looking for wisdom from my peers on this one. Any thoughts?
I think it's a worthwhile project to actually start incorporating, if we are taking the divine counsel material seriously, that the concept that there is not just simply a supernatural world, but that it's a world filled with other divine beings, gods, if you want to call them that way, that are real, that have an effect on the actual physical, tangible world that we humans inhabit, then how would that affect us in greater ways or smaller ways? And, like when you brought up about the doctrines of the church, about baptism, about the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, like those may not necessarily seem to be connected to the divine counsel, but it certainly, there's a certain assumption of certain supernatural realities that even the doctrines of the church had with those two ideas. But those have gone through revision and changes, especially once we got to the Reformation in the Western Church. Then a lot of that got, rethought and rethunked and fought over, and literally like wars and battles were fought for it. Right. And I think it's a worthwhile exercise to go back even to those kind of things and just ask the question. It's like, if we take this most fundamental idea from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, that the gods are real, that nations were divided, that there is this counsel that works for Yahweh, for good or ill, however one views the counsel, then how would that affect some of the things that we've always thought about our reality and thought about our theology even? And I think that, there's going to be some touchstones that no matter what will be affected by a DCW perspective, even if it just adds a little bit. At least it adds to the mosaic of the picture that we've been trying to develop for the last 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a worthy project. The project that you're talking about, that you're working on, like I actually had a chance to help Mike years ago because he wanted a lot of background research and he asked me to help out with that too. And so you're carrying a conversation with him. He initially also wanted to start a conversation with all these other, systematic theology writers and thinkers as well. And so that was part of the research that I had tried to help him out with. And so you're just simply continuing on what he was actually trying to do, which was carry a conversation and just say, let's rethink and let's talk about this.
And that word conversation comes to mind because that's what I feel like I'm doing in the book. And I would like to offer this to our listeners if they care to help. This is just an invitation that I've made known to a couple others, and I'm going to be doing it. If any listener would like to be a part of this, on the level of being a critical ear with me on, during this writing of the book, what I would do is, if you want to give me your email or just respond to me or send a note to my email, I'll put you on a list. And I don't think it'll be that long necessarily. I mean, it could be long, doesn't matter to me, of people who would be willing to get material that I'm writing for, the book as it's being written. I would send you chapters or portions and ask for your critical feedback. Mm-hmm. Emphasis on the word critical. Okay. In other words, if you don't like something, tell me why. And you'd get something probably. I'm just right now getting ready to send out some material, and it would be over the next while here, depending on when you're hearing my voice now. But this is the summer of 2024 as I speak, and I'm in the hot of it right now, and I hope to be done by December of 2024. So anywhere in that timetable, if you'd like to be getting rough drafts of this theology book where I'm literally conversing with Dr. Heiser back and forth and working through a theology of the Divine Counsel worldview, just send me a note to my email address is Ronn Johnson, RONN JOHNSON, the number 7 @gmail.com. So if you'd like, and just say I'd like to be part of the helping with the theology book, something like that, I'll put you on a list and you'll be getting material. And you can respond as you want. You don't have to ever respond if you don't want to, but it would be nice to hear. And this is, I think, just the privilege of being in a world where now we have internet and we have emails that can, help out here. So it's like, to me, it's like crowdsourcing my editors and saying, guys, I need help from every angle here. If you have time and willingness to be part of that, I'd love to hear from you. All right, so we're in chapters 20 and 21 of Genesis. I'm putting two chapters together just based on what I think the amount of discussion will merit. So our goal, again, is not to look at every verse from every angle, but to think about these things from a divine counsel worldview. So let's jump in. 20, verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev, that's in the south. And again, what has just happened is he has witnessed the destruction of Sodom with the salvation or the physical saving of Lot and his two daughters. He goes down to Gerar. Now, Gerar is within the area of Canaan, so that when we say in verse 2, or notice verse 2, Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister, and Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. You say to yourself, didn't I read that story before? Well, you did. It's back in chapter 12. The difference is this time, well, there's similarities here in the story of the beginning of 20 that sound eerily like chapter 12. And by the way, it's going to sound eerily like chapter 26 when Isaac does the same thing with his wife. He says, that's my sister. So like father, like son, but in this story, there's differences such as now there's no famine. This is not a story like in chapter 12. It was caused by a famine. Gerar is not Egypt. It's in the land. Sarah now is fertile. She's able to have a child, whereas the story back in 12 was more about just a Pharaoh wanting this woman. Now the story probably gets into this issue of the danger of losing a claim to his heir if this man lays with his wife. So there's differences in the story clearly that are meant to be understood, but otherwise there's enough similarity. I'm not going to read through it. I'm again, for a divine counsel study, I think this is interesting, but it's not something that will change anything that I'm aware of. So he does use in verse 4, interestingly enough, Abimelech. Now, here's the thing. I guess this does get into a divine counsel issue. Abimelech is not a Jew, or he's not what we're going to call a Hebrew yet, because Abraham, again, is the first one. So he's simply a Canaanite or, a pagan king. And in verse 4, he says, now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, and he's responding to an Elohim in a dream, verse 3, will you kill an innocent, or the word there is tzaddik, righteous. Will you kill a righteous people? And so he's using this word that we have often packed with a lot of theological meaning, righteousness. He's using it my point is, he's using it in a very commonsensical, non-theological way. He never read a book on Israelite theology, so he's not trying to align himself with a view on righteousness here. He's just saying, when it comes to what I did in wanting this man's wife, I didn't even know it's his wife. I just thought it was a woman, and that's what I do. When I see a nice woman, I take her. So I just like to remind us that, we're going to use the word righteous in the meaning of a Yahwist. This man did not use the word that way because the word is malleable enough in Hebrew to be used in the way he just says, as the ESV has, as innocent. So... Mm-hmm. Otherwise, Abraham's called a prophet in this God that, again, God or Elohim. I didn't want to bring it up, Mike, but we have the word Elohim used here in this dream sequence. So it doesn't say Yahweh talked to him; it says God, and I understand that because this is a Jewish readership, that they're often going to take Elohim as Yahweh, as the title for Yahweh. But at least when you have God used in place of Yahweh, at times you're allowed to ask, is this another, divine being? I'm not going to make a case either way, but he's talking to this being, possibly Yahweh, and Yahweh calls Abraham in verse 7 a prophet, which is the first use of Navi in Hebrew in the Bible. And it's, again, not used in the literal sense of a or the strict sense of a Samuel or a Moses, but it seems to be a person who speaks for Yahweh to someone else, and that's why the word Navi is used of him there. Otherwise, the story ends, and this is all of chapter 20, where Abimelech says in verse 9, "Why have you done this to us?" And he gives Sarah back to Abram. And the one thing I do want to bring up, and this is one of those times that here's where, if you were trying to explain a divine counsel worldview to someone, and you took them to a verse, this would be ammunition, in a good sense of the term, to say, here is evidence that plural gods do exist. It's in 2013. I'll pick it up in 12. "Besides, she indeed is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother." He was being technically correct. "And she became my wife. And when," this is 13, "when God caused me to wander from my father's house." Now, every version has a capital G there. Here's the point, though, or here's the interesting issue. The word "caused me to wander," which is just one Hebrew word, is, well, there it is, Hiphiel, perfect third common plural. So the subject causing him to wander is a plural being. Therefore, I would put Elohim in the plural sense. So I would read 2013 to be, "When the gods," plural, "caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me." Da-da-da. Now, again, the reason I think our English Christian versions don't do that is, imagine the trouble it would cause in the audience if the pastor read it that way. "When the gods caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her." So, and this seems to be, my guess would be reference back to Genesis 11, verses 7 through 9. The idea that at the end of the story of the Babel incident, when the world scattered by God's design and was put under the authority of created deities, that story is the basis for Abraham's leaving Ur by Yahweh's design. Remember, Yahweh tells Abraham to leave as well. So that he's looking back upon the story of humanity when he, among many others, left Ur, caused to wander would be the way he says it here, "from my father's house." It's like he's saying, we made the deal way back then that when I left town, you would always say to people, "You are my sister," or I'm your brother. Something like that. So that's probably what he's getting at in 2013. Any thoughts there? You may have heard of this, that it's one of those moments that in the story, our texts are just not fair to us because they don't put in the text what should be in the text.
I do agree. I find it interesting that, because the narrator is being careful with other earlier texts where the word Elohim is used, right? In verse 6, it's a singular, singular third masculine, God said. So you know that it's actually being faithful to the sense that it's faithful to the number. Mm-hmm. It's adjusting correctly to what, so there's a singular being here. Yet, oddly enough, in 13, it does go into plural. And so there is ambiguity in the text. From a Jewish standpoint, I can still see why they would assume Elohim here is still in reference to the Elohim that was talked about earlier. Okay. But one thing that did occur to my mind, though, is that, and this is related to an old episode of from another podcast that Mike used to do, where he talked about how in ancient Near Eastern cultures, they had multiple deities that were representatives or had power over things like famine and death and sickness and so on and so forth. So I wondered a little bit if 13 is a reference to just, because the first time that we see Abraham do something like this was when he went into Egypt because of a famine. Mm-hmm. And so it does cause me to pause and wonder a little bit about that. Is the Elohim reference and just in sort of describing all of those things that caused them to like head into Egypt. It is kind of, I mean, just story wise though, it is a little bit of like, this is now at least decades, if not a good while now since Egypt. And he hasn't learned his lesson from the first time with Egypt, and especially now that his wife is pregnant with the actual promised son. What are you doing, Abraham? like old habits just don't die.
Yeah, and to say it's always a good reminder that as long as he worships the right deity, he's a righteous man, and that his behaviors may not, just like you and me, I guarantee you today we're going to do something that does not look good or right, and yet the Bible would call us righteous. So it's a worship issue, as we say.
Yeah.
Here would be a good time. I think I had said along the way in our times together that, well, let me give you the quick story, and you tell me if I've told the story. I believe I have. The NIV was being updated in early 2000s, and they allowed you as a individual to meet with the general editor, and you had like a 10-minute time slot to give recommended readings for the NIV to be updated. And this was at an ETS meeting, I believe. And I went in with my list of, I think it was 19 places where I would like to see the word God or divine being show up in the text with a small g. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. I found the list. I don't have it on a digital version. I just found it in my files. I'd like to quickly give that list here because, and again, I can do it fast. So if anybody wants it, they can, pause and get the references. But here was what I sat down with the editor, and I have the sheet here. It recommended three things, basically. Where it says the Lord, capital O, capital L, capital R, capital D, I'd rather see Yahweh there. Of course, I knew what he would say. No, that's something we're not going to do in most versions because, again, our Hebrew friends would be offended. So that was my first recommendation, which I knew would be summarily dismissed. The second recommendation was when you have the word malach in Hebrew, put the word messenger in English. Do not ever say angel, because it's a anachronistic term that brings Dante and Milton to mind more than the Bible, as I said. And I have my notes to myself that I said in front of him, and again, he just looked at me. The third point I made was I have 20, counting this one here, places in the Bible where I think if we put in the word God or divine being, God, small g, if we discapitalize the G or put divine being there, it would be more clear to the story of what the Old Testament is telling. And here are the 19 very quick. Genesis 3:5, you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Genesis 6:2, when gods came into the daughters of men, or sons of gods, either way. Genesis 32:28, you have struggled with beings human and divine. Take out the capital G in that story of Jacob, which we'll get to in our podcast. 2013, which was backing up this story here. I didn't include it in my list to the editor, but I would have. It came to pass when gods, plural, caused me to wander. Genesis 35:7, because their divine beings appeared to him, or gods. Again, you could put divine beings or gods, and usually divine beings is less offensive to the English ear than the word small g dos. There's just something about small g ods that makes people wince, but you could have said it. Exodus 20, verse 3, you shall have no other divine beings before me. See, even taking the first of the 10 commandments and clarifying them not as cars and boats and money, but as actual divine beings. I think that needs to be part of our translations. Deuteronomy 32:8, according to the number of the divine beings. 32:17, Deuteronomy, they sacrificed to divine beings they did not know. Judges 13:22, we have seen a divine being. The story of Samson's parents. 1 Samuel 28:13, this is the witch of Endor. I saw a divine being ascending out of the earth. Elohim is in the text, and it's often missed, I think. Job 1:6, the famous passage, when divine beings came to present themselves before Yahweh. Psalm 8:5, you have made him, humans, a little lower than the divine beings. Psalm 82:1, he judges among the divine beings. See, what I'm asking him to do is just be clear in the NIV. These are actual beings that are created, that are spirits, not just, again, using the general word God or something like that. 97:7, Psalms, worship Yahweh, all you divine beings. 97:9, you are exalted far above all divine beings. Isaiah 43:10, before me there was no divine being formed. Isaiah 44:6, besides me there is no divine being. And that gets into the issue of comparative power. Isaiah 45:20, pray to a divine being who cannot save. That was the argument against their idolatry. And then two more, Daniel 3:25, the form of the fourth being in the furnace is like a divine being. On Jonah 1:6, they're on the ship, it's in storm, and the sailors say to Jonah, call on your divine being. Perhaps your divine being will consider us. My hope there was to say to him, as I handed him this paper, was there's better ways to be honest with the Hebrew text in making it clear to the original reader, and thus now the modern reader, that this world believed in these beings and they called them that. So that's where I was curious how this would come across. I saw the new NIV later, and not one of these was followed. So I understood, and that's kind of how he treated it. Like he said, okay, thank you, and on to the next person. So to me, it was a Divine Council worldview moment of, is this going to ever really catch in a popular translation? And at least on that level, it didn't catch in the NIV. So our work's cut out for us, Mike.
I think, there are little moments of here and there. I know, like in the NLT, they'll try to incorporate the idea of an assembly or a council sometimes in those same verses. Kind of off-brand translation that I was into years ago, like when it first came out. It's not very popular today. It was called The Voice. And
I have one. Someone gave me a voice the other day.
They tried to be innovative. Like they tried to take the divine name Yahweh, and they tried to translate it as the uncreated one or the ancient one or something like that. Their whole idea was ultimately to try to use different non-traditional ways of translating certain titles or names of God to kind of like shake you out of your stupor as you're reading, to notice something strange is here. And so sometimes when they got to like these divine being passages, they would mention like an assembly or spiritual beings. So I think bit by bit, more and more people are acknowledging that there is something and there is ambiguity in the text. It can't always just be assumed God with a capital G singular. That there is room in there to make you wonder, and maybe the narrator is doing that purposely to also make the audience wonder.
Sounds good. Thank you. And like I say, we'll keep plodding forward, and in 100 years from now, when we're dead and gone, hopefully this will be old hat. People will have said, why didn't we always think this way? That's my little hope and prayer, that we're just part of a continuing train of thought that helps people move down this path. All right, 21:1. I'm going to be done with 20 if that's okay. And from a Divine Council worldview standpoint, I have nothing more to add than a good study Bible would probably bring out in those verses of chapter 20. But 21:1, the Lord Yahweh visited Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived, verse 2, and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time which God had spoken to him. And we learn in verse 5 that he's 100, which makes Sarah 90. So we're back now to a story. While we're picking up the story of Isaac, recall how the story has gone so far. In 15:2, when Abraham was told he'd be the father of many nations, he reminded God that he was childless and he was old. In 16, that whole story is given to Hagar and Ishmael. And then after the last verse of 16, you don't hear about him again until, well, this chapter. In 17:16, we have again the promise that Sarah would have a son. He was given a name in 17:19, Isaac, or predicted to have the name Laughter. In 17:21, again, I had said this previously, it's a critical moment in the story when God says, I will make Ishmael a great person, but the covenant I'm going to cut with Isaac. That the back and forth relationship that any human wants with a deity, when it comes to how we get along, human and divine, in that world, you would cut a covenant. You would make covenant. That's part of the sacrificial system. You're enjoying a covenant between you and a deity. When it comes to that story, that's going to be Yahweh and Isaac, not Yahweh and Ishmael. And that's so critical, I think, to catch going forward in the story. Even though in chapter 17, Abraham circumcises Ishmael, because it's just part of the way he's going to think that everyone in his household is part of this covenant. In one sense, the covenant is that God will make Abraham a rich man and bless the nations, and he's going to show that by circumcising even his servants, including Ishmael. But now we have heard nothing from Ishmael or that story. We leave him as a 13-year-old boy back in 17. And now we're picking up with the two boys here. And of course, we just had him born, Isaac born in 21:2. So on to 21:3. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore, Isaac. The year, by the way, is 2066 BC. And we get that because Abraham's 100, and we know, and this is another discussion, but the earliest datable event in the Bible from secular means is the birth of Abraham in 2166. If we take the dates of Abraham and his life, accurately, we can date out the birth of Abraham 2166 BC. So now it's 2066. I don't think I need to read any more up through verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. So they will bring the child to age. And of course, the story now breaks back into, well, what about the other side of the story, that we've got a teenage boy here. He's 14. His name is Ishmael. What's interesting, Mike, I don't know what to do with this, but it just occurred to me. The name Ishmael is never used in verses 9 to 21. He's called son of Hagar, the lad, the boy. I mean, talk about a way, that the writer must be telegraphing something, that you could have said Ishmael somewhere. But it's the son of Hagar we're dealing with. I'm not going to show them all to you, but he just keeps referring to him without using his name. It's kind of weird, but maybe the reader, the writer, or the audience would have caught on to that. I don't know. But
it's almost like a subtle turn of hand by the writer of like distancing.
Yeah,
and
it could
sort
be.
of showing a distancing between Isaac and now the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, right? That there's this, not just simply he's the son of Abraham. Now we have the real son of Abraham. Yeah.
Maybe we're getting into tribal factions to the level I won't even use his name. Yeah, remember that? That's the story of Jesus in talking about the Good Samaritan, and Jesus poses, which one was merciful to the beaten man, and they say the one who showed mercy. It's like they couldn't even say the word Samaritan.
Yeah,
I don't know. I've heard that, but maybe that's what's going on. All right, verse 10. Therefore she said to Abraham. Okay, well, verse 9. Interesting. Sarah saw the son of Hagar. We know he's Ishmael. We know he's 14. The Egyptian, kind of adds that word Egyptian in there with a sense of ugh, right? To a reader of Torah, Egypt always has a bad taste in your mouth. And so that's there. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be the heir of my son Isaac. And the point seems to be that the inheritance rights are being at stake here. And so Sarah doesn't want a vie or an alternative to the inheritance that she knows she has through Isaac. So these are being dismissed or dissolved by the sense of casting out this woman and her son together. So, it's a hard moment, to be sure. It's a sad moment to hear this, where she's willing to lose someone who's grown up in her home, but she sees more than just a friendship or even a family issue at stake. This is an inheritance issue to her, probably. But notice 21:11, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Again, you could have said Ishmael, but it just says his son, and that's why, because, going back to, 16 and 17, where Abraham even kind of doubts or doesn't like God's point that Ishmael's not going to be the heir, and he has to be reminded, no, it's the son of Sarah that's going to have the heir. So my guess, like any dad, you'd have a strong love for your son, and he was not, and that's what 21:11 is trying to say. He was really attached to Ishmael, and he's being told a story right in front of him that the God that he worships is not covenanted with this boy. Now, that might have gone both ways, and I think it did, frankly. I think Ishmael did not want a covenant with Yahweh, because if there's anything the biblical story allows for it, that anyone who wants to covenant with Yahweh, he's invited to do so. And I'm with Dr. Heiser on this, that election, and he had a lot to say about that, right? Election is never meant to be this double-edged sword theologically, where God looks down from the heavens. And I know this is a caricature of the Reform position that most Reformers don't have, that God looks down from the heavens and says, A, B, C, I'm going to choose the ones I love, and I'm going to choose the ones that are going to go to hell. That's a very, like I say, caricaturized view of things, and no one would, in my hearing, no one's ever claimed that. The point is that, as Mike said, and I was coming to this view in a very similar way, in a completely different means of reading different things and going through the Divine Council worldview discussions that we would have, that election is all about choosing a person, Abraham, who then comes along and creates the covenant back with Yahweh. And so it's a two-way street, and that's where election will show up as. It's I chose Abraham, and he also chose me. And so as long as this covenant is in play, even within individuals, be it Isaac and Jacob and so forth, and not Esau and Ishmael, that's how I can use the word election. It's not God choosing people to go to heaven when they die. It's God covenanting with people. So who did God elect in this story, if we want to use it that way? He elected Abraham, and he elected Isaac. But that's not to say that Ishmael didn't turn from Yahweh and, in a sense, become pagan on his own volition, shall we say. I'm totally fine with that. Anything you want to add there?
I would also add, because we're looking at English, I decided to just take a quick look at what was going on in verse 9 when the son of Hagar, or Ishmael, that Sarah saw him laughing. And I realized that the word laughing there is actually different from the word laugh or to laugh that was used to describe Isaac. The laughing that the son of Hagar did, it has the connotation of ridicule, of mockery, of scorn.
Yeah, in fact, the ESV has scoffing.
Interesting.
Or the New King James has scoffing.
Yeah, so there is something there that almost like a hint of the rivalry that's happening between Isaac and Ishmael. And I don't think it's an accident. Again, yes, there's like I said earlier, there's that distancing language of the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, but you brought up the great point that yes, Egyptian is going to elicit some sort of guttural reaction from the audience who are listening to this, because the feelings towards what Egypt had done historically in their people's history is going to elicit a lot of feeling. And so to have the son of an Egyptian woman who is mocking or scorning or scoffing at essentially one of the patriarchs of the lineage of Israel, there's something it just makes you wonder that there is something going on here, that the writer is sort of communicating to the audience, and the audience is sort of probably reacting and reaffirming what the writer is saying. It's like, yes, like of course she would react that way, because why are you laughing at the newborn? Why are you scoffing? Why are you making fun of him? But yeah, it's just a curious kind of word choice that it's in a very one verse saying very clearly there's this rivalry that is happening between these two sons of Abraham that we don't even want to acknowledge that they are both sons of Abraham.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Let me give you and I can only do this with you, Mike. If I did this again in Sunday school tomorrow, I'd be in trouble. Here we go. I'm going to give you a theory that because of a divine counsel worldview, you're able to at least consider the possibility of this next idea that I'm going to show you. 21:12. But Elohim, no article, but an Elohim said to Abraham, remember what Abraham just said was, or thought, I don't want to lose Ishmael. I love that boy. Imagine this story now happening. An Elohim says to Abram, do it. Don't be displeased. And now I'm going to read the verse. Don't be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says, do it. For through Isaac, that's your offspring. You get him. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. What's the possibility that the being talking to Abraham here is not Yahweh, but somebody else? I'm just saying, at least we have to ask the question, based on verse 13, that someone is claiming, and I know it's representative of 16, where God said, I'm going to, he's going to be a great person, Ishmael, but my covenant I'm going to make with Isaac. Now, is it, okay, let me just say, if it's possible, let's play it out. Let's just test drive this idea. And I'm going to read the rest of the chapter as though a different Elohim from Yahweh is verse 12 and on. But an Elohim said to Abraham, okay, so go ahead and do it. Let him go. I'm going to make a nation out of this boy because you get Isaac. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and skin and water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, a very desert area. It's you have to have guts to live down in this area. It's not well watered, but those that live in the south in Israel, I have been told, are very proud of it, because you have to work your way through life. You don't have it given to you in a breadbasket like you do up in Galilee. Anyway, when the water of the skin was gone, she put the child, again, no name, under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, and she said, let me not look on the death of this child, the child. Here's my point. It's an extremely critical moment, life and death. It's just like a story, is it not, that when you're in a critical moment, you're ready to listen to a God who comes to you. I mean, it's not necessarily a good statement. I'm just saying that that's how critical this is trying to show the story to be. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and cried. Okay, so here you got a story of a woman crying, a boy about to die, and I don't believe there's an article. Nope. And Elohim heard the voice of the boy. And this is the first time it's ever used in the Bible, and the only time where you have no article in front of Malach. All the other times, and there's like 4 or 5 other times, it's going to say the messenger of Elohim, and then you can play it out in the stories that where it happens that messenger of Elohim is the messenger of Yahweh. This is the only time in the Bible, Old Testament, where you get in Hebrew an angel, a malach, no article, of Elohim. Okay? So read it again, 21:17. And a God heard the voice of the boy, and a messenger of that God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for Elohim," can notice the missing Yahweh here. I mean, nothing's going to say Yahweh in the whole story. "For Elohim has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then Elohim opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin of water and gave it to the boy, gave the boy a drink. And Elohim was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. And the last verse of 21, he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took for him a wife from the land of, you guessed it. We are not going the way of a Yahwist. We are coloring the story, we're coloring the story purposely with that moment of, Egypt. So, again, don't try this at home. I'm tempted not even to bring this up to my Sunday school, because again, we've got about 24 older folks sitting in a big circle, and we're talking about Genesis and enjoying it. But boy, would I mess up things, I think, if I brought this up. Is it not possible, though, that the God that Ishmael worships, he got him here? This is where he found him. He was about to die, and this God heard the voice of him and does what a God loves to do, and that is to find a person at his low point and say, "I'll make of you something you have no idea." In other words, I'm going to make you promises that will make you happy, and that person says, "I'll do it. I'll make you my deity, my personal patron deity." And the reason I go this way as a possibility, 62% thinking this, is that we know that Ishmael turns out to be a non-Yahwist based on how the story progresses. And where better can we find the place where he meets the non-Yahwist God or the non-Yahweh God than right here? And the text numerous times could have said Yahweh and didn't. It gives us that general category of a Elohim, and it just drops into the story, to me, the wonderful possibility that this is the story of where Ishmael gets his deity. So what do you think?
I remember you have mentioned this before. I can't remember how many episodes ago, but you had alluded to it, and now we're fully going into it. I think, so initial hot take. I think depending on how you view, for example, the authorship of the book of Genesis, this may affect how this material is viewed, right? Because if I was going from, for example, a document hypothesis view, I would probably be one of those folks that would say, "Aha, this is an e-source, this is an Elohim source," right, because I just keep seeing Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. But in the end, it's still talking about the same God, the God of the Jews.
Yeah, but if I may interject, that whole JEDP thing was all done by German. Starts with Germans who never consulted a divine council worldview. Fair enough. Oh,
exactly. But like I'm saying, like from like wherever you're coming from, of how you view, like how was this text even formed in the first place, right? And so I'm not coming from a JDEP. I'm not coming from a document hypothesis view, but I can see how some may see it this way. Some who tried to come from a JDEP but also still be Orthodox or evangelical, I could possibly see that they would also reconcile it with whoever ultimately, the team of people that ultimately fashioned what we have finally in the final form of Genesis, probably around the time of Babylon, that they would have taken these different strands, traditions, materials, so probably a core of it being Moses written, and then crafting it together. And so you have this interesting kind of tapestry where you have, yes, this story that is using Elohim and not Yahweh. And so but the audience target is Jews who are living and coming out from exile in Babylon. And so the assumption then again is whenever we see Elohim, it must be talking about the God of the Jews. But I do appreciate you bringing up these ambiguities that are in the text, because it is curious. But here's one thing, I guess my initial almost like guttural reaction or pushback is that, let's say, for example, that it is true that it is some sort of not Yahweh, just a divine being talking with Abraham as he's feeling distressed about Sarah's command, send the boy away.
That's a problem to my view. Verse 12. So if a non-Yahweh deity says to Abraham, hey, go ahead and do it, and then claims Isaac, hey, he's yours, but I'm going to take, verse 13, I'm going to take Ishmael. The problem that my view would have would be you have got Abraham listening to a non-Yahweh deity and obeying that deity.
Yeah, and then the question I immediately would have is, did this not break loyalty with Yahweh?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, at least, I didn't take it that far. Let's see, how can I defend myself?
That's what I mean. It's like the ambiguity of the text, but that was one of the first things that came in my mind. Mm-hmm. I do think, and I think I had talked about this a few episodes before. I mentioned about J. Richard Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence. The main thrust of his book, of his scholarly exegesis work, was to try to examine the whole moment of Abraham and Isaac on the mountain as God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac.
How about I didn't want to cut you off. Are you done? I'm going to give you a defense of how the deity talking to Abraham is not Yahweh. Okay? And I know we're getting to this, but it's going to be my call on Genesis 32, and I think I can defend it when we get there pretty easily. In Genesis 32, Jacob is a Yahwist. Can I give away my view of this now? I think, we got a few minutes, because I'm done with chapter 21 except for this issue. So let me take you to a defense of what you just said, and I had to quick think, okay, do we have an example of the Old Testament of a Yahwist who listens to the voice of another deity and who's not yet disloyal? I would go to Genesis 32. Jacob, verse 1, went on his way, and messengers of Elohim met him. No article there. Messengers of Elohim met him. Probably just humans, because of verse 3. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau. So probably, well, I don't know. I mean, you could have that he's meeting divine beings there. In fact, I would argue, this is getting too deep right now. He does say,
verse 2, this is Elohim's camp. Right.
So probably verse 1 is saying he's meeting these divine beings who are not Yahweh. And again, that looks weird on the front cover of Time magazine. It's not weird to them, because now go to verse 22, the famous story that, again, we're going to spend a whole podcast or two on. He arose that night and took his 2 wives, 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. That's the border of Sihon, king of Og's kingdom. We learn from other places. He took them and sent them over the brook. The point being, when you cross over a territorial boundary, the original writer would have said, interesting. I wonder what's going to happen over there, shall we say. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now when he saw that he, that being, did not prevail against him, Jacob, he, the divine being, touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him, Jacob. And the divine being said, I'm just paraphrasing, he said, let me go, for the day breaks. But he, Jacob, said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but struggled with a divine being, Israel. For you have struggled with a divine being and with men and have prevailed. And Jacob asked him, saying, tell me your name, I pray. And he said, well, why do you ask me my name? And he blessed him. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen a divine being face to face, and my life is preserved. I'm quoting from the Jerusalem Publication Society version. The Jewish version has the word divine being numerous places here. And he crosses over, Now you get into, and we'll do this on that podcast when we get there, that Hosea 12, verse 4, condemns Jacob for this entire incident. The fact that he asked the Malach, it said, for a blessing. He should not have done it. So Hosea 12, clearly in my mind, I don't know how people miss this. I really don't. How do you miss that Hosea 12:4 condemns this story, saying he should never have asked for a blessing from this being? But he did, because that's what you do when you meet a divine being. You ask for a blessing. And so my understanding of 32 will be, and we'll take time from every angle to look at it, I'm going to agree with the Jerusalem Publication Society version. That is, he struggled with a divine being who was not Yahweh. And he asked the wrong thing. He did something a Yahwist should never do. And that is talk to a divine being to the level of even asking for a blessing. So now, if I go back, and I'm defending myself on the fly, but I'm doing the best I can. If I go back to 21:12 and I have a divine being who is not Yahweh, tell Abraham to send out Ishmael. Is it possible that he did listen to the voice? Like Jacob asked for a blessing, could Abraham have made a mistake? And, again, when a divine being comes to you, and I'm thinking of Adam and Eve, same thing, do you just summarily say, or do you say, whoa, I've got a divine being in front of me? This is 1 Corinthians 10. Yeah, I know this, and we're closing up shop, so let me give you a New Testament verse that would defend this too. 1 Corinthians, I might have appealed to this before on our podcast, so let me, tell me if I did. 1 Corinthians 10:11. Now all these things have happened to them, the Old Testament saints, as examples. They were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. For no temptation has overtaken you, which is such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able, but with the temptation also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Stop right there before you read on. What is the temptation he's talking about? I think is the next verse. Therefore, flee from idolatry. That the temptation of the early church person was, I'm listening to divine voices all the time, and I need to center my attention on Jesus. Because God will make a way of escape. There are many good people probably in the mind of Paul who don't make that escape. They should, but they don't. And that's why he tells them you need to flee from idolatry, listening to the voices of other deities, because it's so easy to mistake them, to hear them, to respect them. And again, we're getting into Exodus now, and then where God tells us to respect deities, not trust them, but respect them. Well, remember that verse?
I think I remember. I'm thinking of Jude.
Exodus 23:28, especially in the Septuagint. You shall not revile gods, plural, nor curse a ruler of your people. The point being that I don't want you to worship them, but you do need to respect them. They have a role to play, and that's Divine Counsel 101. They have a role to play, and so we respect the role they have. I don't like it when I hear fellow Divine Counsel people say or imply that because of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, I get to now play fast and loose, or at least imply this is how they think of it, that they get to play fast and loose with spirits. I told you the story before, being invited as a prof to a haunted house here in the Minneapolis area. No, that's the point. You don't play fast and loose with that stuff. You respect it as real, but you stay away. And to me, that's just, again, I'm wandering now, Mike, but I'm trying to think of ways to get around the box, the painted corner that I have myself in, that 21:12 has Abraham listening to a voice who's not Yahweh.
Yeah, I think it leaves ambiguity for there. I'll provide a little slight opening, but I will say that I could push back as well about the Hosea 12 reference, right? Because I get what you mean about what Hosea 12, especially since it's indictment, prophetic, writing. But there is also a parallelism that's happening with then verse 5, with Yahweh, the God of hosts. Yahweh is his name, is his memorial name. And I think that was actually also where Mike went with the identity of this interesting man who apparently was a malach that Jacob strove with. I just think there is something like the wrong that I would assume, if, say, from a perspective that if this malach and this divine being is the Lord that Jacob had wrestled with, what was wrong with it? It was the fact that he resisted Yahweh. He actually,
or why was Yahweh trying to beat him up is another one.
Yeah, which is probably just like, dude, you gotta because the later, what we saw later is that Esau was actually kind to Jacob.
Oh, I see what you're looking at in Hosea 12:5. Yeah, that's very different from this. And I have a New King James open in front of me. That's very different from the Jewish Bible. It has, I forget the wording, again, we should save that study for when we get to 32. But the Hebrew rendering, or the Jewish Tanakh, or the Jewish Study Bible that you can buy, it has verse 5 that Yahweh is not the being of verse 4. And it contrasts 5 with 4 instead of saying that was. Again, I'm always nervous that my Christian Bible is going to put, Jesus and Yahweh in places he probably isn't. But anyway, that's a conversation for that time. So it'll be fun to get through that. But we need to wrap up 21. Anything else? As you've said, I appreciate it. Again, I'm throwing the stuff at you, but and I'm only on, what did I say, 62%, thinking that this God speaking to Ishmael is not Yahweh. At least here's what I would say to a person who wants to have a DCW: at least consider the which God question at every turn. Always consider which God, because that's what the text is always doing. It's always wanting you to be very careful about which God we're talking about. And if it says Yahweh, I know who it is. If it says Most High, I know who it is. If it says Elohim, I don't know necessarily who it is. I've got to do my homework and at least expect to have some, as you call it, ambiguity. What'd you call it?
It's ambiguous. Ambiguity. It is ambiguity.
So. Next time when we get back together, it is that famous story of Abraham being asked to kill his son. So that will be enough. There's another one where we've got to say, what in the world is going on here?
I do think, though, Ron, you did bring up a very interesting kind of question that is going on here. But see, like there is that ambiguity. I do wonder what is going on. I do also understand and appreciate that what Sarah is asking of Abraham was to safeguard the promise son. And I do wonder, and I'm, I'll admit, I'm a little influenced by Middleton's, Abraham Silence work, in that this incident is built up into 22, into the sacrifice of Isaac, and that I don't see a problem with it, this Elohim, this divine being Yahweh, because then it would also fit along with what, how Abraham resisted the idea of like, if only Ishmael could be. Well,
here, and let me whet the taste buds of the listener for the next podcast. 22:1. Let me preface this with what I just studied on my own, again, with the aid of with the computer. It takes 3.5 seconds to do this. How many times does the word Elohim occur with or without the article, the, ha Elohim, as opposed to just Elohim? And it was around 96%. It's very, very common that the word Elohim just sits by itself, does not have an article. So that makes it more like, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. There's no article there. So most of the time, and again, in writing to a Jewish audience, when you say Elohim, you're talking about Yahweh because it's a Jewish book. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. So more interesting is just studying the occurrences of the Elohim passages, because why would 4% of the time the writer in the Old, or the writers of the Old Testament, not give you the expected anarthrous or no article use of Elohim? Here's what's interesting is that again, it's just a 65% possibility, but I'm leaning this way, that when you have the word the in front of Elohim, it makes you say, which one? In other words, are you talking about one we've just talked about, or are you talking about one that we know of or something like that? It just pauses the reader enough to say which one, okay? Here's how, and we should have said this, as we end 21, the second to last verse, because the story, again, is which Elohim is always in play, look at how 33 goes. Then Abram planted a tamarisk tree. He just purchases land, or he makes a treaty with Abimelech. We didn't talk about this, but he makes a treaty with Abimelech that secures a legal right to the well of Beersheba. That's really what the story at the end of 21 is about, which is, again, rather historical, but again, if every story of the Bible does rotate eventually around a which God question, then at the end of 21, you have in verse 33 something that makes great sense. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on, boy, my radar's going off. As soon as I hear that, I want to know which one. He called on the name of Yahweh, the Olam Elohim. The Olam, that everlasting, or, the big one, the one that runs everything is how I would kind of paraphrase that. The everlasting God is fine. And Abraham journeyed in the land of the Philistines many days. Next line. Now it came to pass after these things that the article's there, that the God tested Abraham. Now, likely because of the proximity, I'm going to say that's the 33 God. That's the everlasting God. The one that we just talked about. The problem is, or at least the other side of this, is that you could have that God, that Elohim, being the one. Again, there's so much you have to read into this, and I'm not trying to make my case, but I'm just saying here's how you'd have to think of it originally. Could we be speaking of a different deity that we've just had, talk to him back in 21:12 about Ishmael? What if that deity says to him, go kill your son? Because that's all you have is the deity. Verse 3, it's there again. He went to the place of which the deity had told him. Then on the third day, he gets ready to kill him. You go down to 9. They came to the place of which of the 4% or so that it's used, it's there in 9. The deity had told him. Abraham built an altar. Abraham stretched out, and then 11, the Malach of, first time in the story, Yahweh. Now you get Yahweh involved. In other words, could it be? And this is, I know what some are saying. Oh, Johnson, you're going down the way of JEDP and liberals who don't want Yahweh telling Abraham to kill his son because, in other words, there's only one God and God did the whole thing. I'm just saying that don't accuse by saying that's what a liberal believes. Just look at the story. Does it allow for Abraham to be what Paul will later predict to be a temptation that takes every person to the end of their days? They're going to be hearing voices, and they've got to be careful. Okay, I'm just throwing it out there and this is next time, so I'm giving away a lot more than I need, but we've got our work ahead of us in thinking through the issue of which deity, even in the story of, one of the most famous ones here.
I think what this does show is that when you start bringing in the factor of the word Elohim is not always in reference to Yahweh, that then you have very interesting divergent, possibilities in the text. So I think that's kind of like where, can you play and have that kind of sandlot to kind of test and play those ideas out? I still personally, I would still probably say, for example, like you were talking about 22, I would still say it's probably Yahweh, but I do get what you're getting at because it is interesting. I just don't understand exactly what was the intention unless there is supposed to be almost this tension that the writer is even putting in there to try to make you wonder, wait, is this Yahweh? Mm-hmm. But it actually is, but it's supposed to create that sense of nervousness of like, Abraham, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's a good conversation.
Let's save it for next time. So please do come to our next podcast, because we have to walk through it again and take our time with it. And I'll give you the statistics more carefully about the, when Ha Elohim is used and how interestingly that story pulls out of the Old Testament. So, all right. Well, thank you again, Mike. I do appreciate your time. You're coming into this cold so many ways that it's unfair to you. At the same time, I was just telling my wife how the reason I enjoy this is because Mike, he's my coffee partner here, and I get to dump on him. He doesn't mind. He doesn't mind at all. So, and best wishes in your doctoral work. I know you got a couple of busy weeks ahead of you, so I'll leave you alone.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Always fun to be able to do these, though. So, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And until next time, God bless.